Blizzard and the Last Companion, a story of survival, trust, and redemption. In the heart of a raging blizzard, David Walker, a reclusive former soldier, hears a desperate scratching at his cabin door. When he opens it, he finds a half-frozen German Shepherd-Husky mix, shielding her two tiny puppies against the brutal cold. She is weak, starving, and covered in scars, evidence of a past filled with cruelty. David, a man who has long shut himself off from the world, takes them in, unknowingly stepping into a battle far greater than the storm outside. Luna, the mother dog, isn't just a stray, she's running from something. And when her former owner, a violent man named Kyle Robertson, comes looking for her, David must decide, stay in the shadows or fight for something worth protecting. As danger closes in, David and Luna form an unbreakable bond. Together they face the demons of their pasts, hers filled with pain, his with loneliness. In a final confrontation, David risks everything to protect his newfound family, proving that love, trust, and second chances can be found in the most unexpected places. This is more than a rescue story. It's about redemption, about finding hope when all seems lost. And in the end, both David and Luna realize they weren't just saving each other. They were saving themselves.
Blizzard and the Last Companion. Scene 1, the storm and the cry for help. The blizzard howled through the dense forest, its icy grip tightening around the desolate mountain landscape. Snowflakes, like tiny daggers, slashed through the air, carried by relentless winds that rattled the wooden walls of a lone cabin nestled deep in the wilderness. Inside, David Walker, a retired soldier, sat by the crackling fireplace, his calloused hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The storm had trapped him in isolation for days, and the eerie silence of the snowfall was only broken by the occasional creak of the logs in the hearth. David had chosen this life, away from people, away from memories that haunted his past. The outside world no longer held much meaning for him. His cabin, his books, the quiet, those were enough. Or so he had convinced himself. Then it came. A sound, faint but distinct, scratching against the wooden door. David frowned, lowering his mug. He strained his ears, wondering if the howling wind had merely played tricks on him. But there it was again, a soft, desperate whimper, barely audible over the raging storm. His heart rate quickened. Instinct kicked in, honed from years of survival training. He set his mug down, stood up, and moved cautiously toward the door. Grabbing the shotgun propped against the wall, he peered through the frosted window. And then he saw her. A husky German Shepherd mix, her coat thick but matted with ice, stood trembling just outside his door. Snow clung to her fur, her breath coming in ragged puffs of mist. Pressed against her were two tiny puppies, barely visible beneath her protective stance. Their small bodies were almost buried under the accumulating snow, and their feeble whimpers were nearly lost in the wind. David hesitated. Opening the door meant bringing trouble inside. Stray animals could be sick, aggressive, or worse, attract unwanted predators. Yet, as his eyes met the mother's, something deep within him stirred. There was a desperate plea in those amber eyes, a silent cry for help. For a long moment, he stood motionless, hand hovering over the doorknob, his mind warring between caution and compassion. But then, the wind shifted, blowing a sharp gust of snow directly onto the already fragile puppies. One of them let out a weak cry, struggling to move. That was it. David cursed under his breath and yanked the door open. The icy wind rushed in like an intruder, making the fire flicker violently. The mother dog remained frozen in place, uncertainty flashing in her eyes. She didn't step forward immediately. "Come on, girl. Get in here before you freeze to death," David coaxed, his voice firm but not unkind. She hesitated, glancing back at her puppies, then down at the threshold as if she feared a trap. When she finally took a step, it was slow, cautious. The smaller of the two puppies attempted to follow, but stumbled in the thick snow, too weak to stand. Without hesitation, the mother picked it up gently by the scruff and carried it inside. The second puppy followed, dragging its tiny legs over the wooden floor. David quickly shut the door, sealing out the storm's fury. The sudden warmth of the cabin caused the mother dog to tremble more violently, her body adjusting to the temperature shift. Her ears twitched, and her wary eyes scanned the unfamiliar surroundings. The puppies, too exhausted to care, collapsed onto the rug near the fire, their tiny chests rising and falling in shallow breaths. David moved to the couch, grabbing an old blanket. As he approached, the mother flinched, lowering her head defensively. "Easy, girl. I'm not going to hurt you," he murmured, setting the blanket down beside her instead of draping it over. She sniffed it hesitantly before nudging the fabric around her pups, wrapping them in its warmth. David knelt, studying them closer. The puppies were impossibly small, their fur damp and thin. They had barely opened their eyes. They couldn't have been more than a few days old. Reaching out, he attempted to touch one, but the mother let out a low warning growl. Not aggressive, but protective. All right, he muttered, raising his hands in surrender. "You're a good mom. You've been through hell, haven't you?" The dog didn't answer, of course, but there was something in the way she gazed at him, a mix of exhaustion, fear, and reluctant trust. Standing up, David moved to the kitchen. He filled a bowl with warm water and set it a few feet away from her. She eyed him warily, then, after a long pause, crawled forward and began lapping at the water greedily. The pup stirred at the movement, but remained huddled close to her warmth. David exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Where the hell did you come from?" he muttered, more to himself than to the dog. Her condition suggested she had been on her own for a while, long enough to grow weak and desperate, but not enough to give up. The fact that she had made it this far, carrying her newborns through a deadly blizzard, was nothing short of a miracle. But now what? David wasn't prepared for this. He had spent years living alone, avoiding complications. A stray dog and her two helpless pups were the last thing he had expected to take in. And yet, as he watched the mother curl protectively around her little ones, the weight of exhaustion finally pulling her eyelids shut, he knew he couldn't turn them away. "You've got a fighter's spirit," he said softly, leaning back against the wall, arms crossed. "I'll give you that." The dog let out a tired sigh, resting her head against her paws. David glanced toward the storm still raging outside. Whatever fate had brought her here tonight, it had also given him a choice. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel so alone. Blizzard and the last companion seen too, the uninvited guest. The warmth of the cabin contrasted sharply with the icy storm still raging outside. Snow piled up against the windows, and the wind continued to howl like a wild beast searching for a way in. But inside, the flickering fire cast a golden glow over the wooden floor, where three unexpected guests lay, one exhausted mother and her two helpless pups. David Walker watched them from his chair, his rough hands wrapped around a half-empty mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The mother dog, a husky German Shepherd mix, lay curled protectively around her puppies, her thick but unkempt fur slowly drying in the cabin's warmth. Her ribs were visible beneath her coat, a stark reminder of how long she had been struggling to survive out there. The pups, tiny, fragile, and barely able to move, were pressed against her belly, too weak to do anything other than breathe. David had seen desperation before, had witnessed men on the battlefield with that same haunted look in their eyes. But seeing it in a dog's face, something about it hit different. He let out a sigh and stood, stretching his stiff muscles. "Well, I guess I should figure out what to do with you," he muttered, walking toward the kitchen. He rummaged through the cabinets, searching for anything remotely suitable for a dog. He didn't keep pet food, hadn't owned a dog in years, but there had to be something. He finally settled on some leftover roasted chicken, pulling it apart into small, manageable pieces. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. When he turned back, the mother dog was watching him, her amber eyes wary but alert. "Yeah, I see you," he said, walking slowly toward her. "Not planning to poison you, if that's what you're worried about." She didn't move. Her muscles were tense, her gaze locked on him with the intensity of an animal that had learned the hard way not to trust too easily. David crouched a few feet away and set the bowl down on the floor. Then, just as slowly, he backed away and sat down in his chair again, letting her make the choice. For a long moment, nothing happened. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and David just sat there, just watching. Then, cautiously, the dog stretched her neck forward and sniffed the bowl. She hesitated, looking up at David once more, as if waiting for some sign of permission. "Go ahead," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "It's for you." Still watching him, she finally took a tentative bite. Then another. And then, as if realizing the food was real and not some cruel trick, she devoured the rest in seconds. David exhaled, feeling an odd sense of satisfaction. He had fed stray dogs before. Hell, he had fed half-starved men before. But this felt different. When she finished, she licked her lips and turned her attention back to her pups. One of them let out a weak whimper, barely able to move. The mother nosed it gently, shifting her body so that they could nestle against her warmth. David rubbed the back of his neck. "You're gonna need a name," he muttered, studying her. She flicked her ears but didn't look at him. David considered for a moment. Something strong, something fitting. "Luna," he finally said. "Yeah, Luna suits you." She didn't react, of course, but somehow the name felt right. A night of watching and waiting hours passed, and the storm outside showed no sign of relenting. The snowdrifts against the windows had grown higher, nearly blocking the view. The wind whistled through the cracks in the old cabin, but the fire kept the inside warm. David sat in his chair, keeping an eye on Luna and her pups. She was still tense, her body coiled protectively around them. Every time he moved, even slightly, her ears twitched, her gaze darting toward him. "I'm not going to hurt them," David murmured, more to himself than to her. She didn't relax. Not yet. David had seen that kind of deep-seated fear before, seen it in war survivors, in people who had been pushed too far and had learned never to trust easily again. Whoever had owned her before hadn't been kind. That much was obvious. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling. "You've been through some real shit, haven't you?" Luna let out a quiet sigh, her body trembling slightly as exhaustion finally started to claim her. She fought it at first, keeping her head up, watching him. But little by little, her eyes began to droop, her breathing slowed. And finally, for the first time, she let her head rest fully on the blanket. David watched, strangely relieved. She was still on edge, but at least now she was letting herself sleep. That was progress. Morning comes, but the cold remains. When David woke the next morning, the first thing he noticed was the absence of the wind. The storm had passed. For the first time in days, sunlight streamed through the window, casting golden streaks across the wooden floor. The second thing he noticed was the smell of wet fur. Luna and her pups were still there, curled up near the fire. The mother was awake now, her head resting on her paws as she watched him. David sat up and stretched, his bones aching from sleeping in the chair. "Morning, girl," he said, his voice rough with sleep. She flicked her ears in acknowledgement, but didn't move. David stood and made his way to the kitchen, grabbing a can of soup from the shelf. He poured some into a bowl, warming it over the fire before carefully setting it near Luna. "It's not much," he admitted, "but it's better than nothing." She sniffed the air, then slowly moved toward the bowl, lapping at the warm liquid. David watched, noticing that she moved slightly less cautiously now. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to trust him. Maybe she was realizing she was safe here. He let out a breath and looked outside, at the vast stretch of snow covering the world beyond his cabin. It was peaceful, but something still felt off. A strange feeling crawled at the back of his mind, an instinct he had learned to trust over the years. He glanced back at Luna. She had finished eating and was now gently licking her pups, her maternal instincts stronger than ever. But every few moments, her ears twitched, her eyes flicking toward the door, like she was expecting something, like she knew something was coming. David frowned. He moved toward the window, peering outside. The snow-covered landscape stretched before him, untouched. But just beyond the tree line, barely noticeable, there were tracks, footprints, and they weren't his. His jaw tightened. "Well, shit," he muttered. Luna let out a low, almost inaudible growl. David reached for the rifle leaning against the wall. Whoever had left those tracks, they weren't just passing through, and something told him they weren't done looking. Scene 3. Scars of the past. The morning light seeped through the frost-lined windows, casting long beams across the wooden floor of the cabin. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind an eerie stillness that settled over the snow-covered landscape. It was a silence David Walker had grown accustomed to over the years, but today it felt different. He stood at the window, his gaze fixed on the tree line where he had seen the footprints the night before. The snow had smoothed over some of the impressions, but the signs were still there. Someone had been close. Too close. David exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He wasn't a paranoid man, but he trusted his instincts, and right now, those instincts were telling him that trouble wasn't far behind. Behind him, a soft rustling sound broke the quiet. He turned to see Luna stretching on the blanket near the fire, her body still curled protectively around her two pups. The little ones stirred, their tiny limbs twitching as they adjusted in their sleep. Luna's amber eyes flickered up to meet his, watching him with cautious curiosity. David stepped forward slowly. "Morning, girl," he murmured. Luna didn't respond, but she didn't flinch either. That was progress. He crouched near her, careful not to invade her space. Now that she was a little more relaxed, he could get a better look at her, and what he saw made his stomach tighten. Scars, faint but unmistakable, crisscrossing her legs, her shoulders, and most notably around her neck. Someone had hurt her, not just neglected her, abused her. David clenched his jaw. He had seen scars like these before, not just on animals, but on people, on soldiers. He knew what they meant. A past filled with suffering, with pain that ran deeper than the skin. Luna tensed as his eyes lingered on the marks. "It's okay," David said softly, his voice careful, controlled. "No one's gonna hurt you here." Luna held his gaze for a long moment before turning her attention back to her pups. She nosed them gently, ensuring they were warm, safe. David took a slow breath. Whoever had owned her before, they hadn't deserved her. First steps of trust. David stood and made his way to the kitchen, rummaging through the pantry. He found some leftover chicken from last night and a few slices of bread, setting them on a plate before filling a bowl with fresh water. He placed them a short distance away from Luna, then stepped back, giving her space. For a moment, she simply watched him, testing him. Then, slowly, she crept forward, her movements hesitant but determined. She sniffed at the food before taking a small bite, chewing carefully. David watched in silence. It wasn't just hunger that made her wary, it was habit. She had learned to be cautious, to never assume food came without a price. It took several minutes, but eventually, she finished everything. "Good girl," David murmured. Luna lifted her head at the words. There was no recognition in her expression, but for the first time, she didn't look away immediately. A small victory. The pups in the past. David crouched again, glancing at the pups. They were still tiny, their fur barely thick enough to keep them warm despite the fire. "How the hell did you make it through that storm?" he muttered, shaking his head. Luna's ears twitched, as if she understood the question. David didn't know much about where she had come from, but one thing was certain. She hadn't gotten here by accident. She had been running, and not just from the cold. David frowned, glancing back at the footprints outside. From the looks of it, someone had been looking for her, which meant they weren't safe yet. He let out a slow breath and ran a hand through his graying hair. A life once lived. David hadn't always been a recluse. Once, a long time ago, he had been part of something bigger. A soldier, a leader, a man with purpose. But life had a way of changing things, a war that took too much, a mistake that haunted him. And before he knew it, he had traded the battlefield for solitude, hiding from the world in a cabin far from everything. He had told himself he didn't need anyone. But now, looking at Luna, curled up with her pups, he realized something. Maybe he had been wrong. Maybe, just maybe, he had needed this. Someone to need him. A visitor in the night that evening, as the fire crackled and the wind whispered through the trees, David sat near the window, rifle close at hand. Luna lay near the hearth, her eyes half-lidded but still alert. The pups twitched in their sleep, their tiny bodies pressed close against her warmth. Outside, the darkness stretched beyond the cabin, cold and unforgiving. And then, a sound. Not the wind, not an animal. A footstep. David's grip tightened on the rifle. Luna's ears perked, her body tensing. Slowly, carefully, David moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the curtain. The tree line was still, the snow-covered ground untouched, but something felt wrong. He waited, listening, watching. And then, just beyond the porch, a shadow moved, a figure, standing there, watching. David's breath slowed, his muscles coiled, ready. Luna let out a deep guttural growl. Not just fear, recognition. David's jaw tightened. Whoever they weren't just passing through. And if they had come for Luna, they would have to go through him first. Scene 4. The shadow in the woods. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the snow-covered landscape. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire provided a stark contrast to the growing chill outside. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie quiet that stretched across the forest like a heavy fog. David Walker stood near the window, rifle in hand, staring at the spot where he had seen the figure the night before. Nothing moved now. But that didn't mean no one was there. Behind him, Luna lay curled around her two pups, Shadow and Frost, her ears twitching at every sound. She had barely rested since last night, her body remaining tense even when she appeared to sleep. She knew, whatever or whoever had been watching them. Luna had seen them before, and she was afraid. David exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He had dealt with danger before. People who lurked in the dark, waiting for the right moment to strike. He had faced them on foreign battlefields, in war-torn cities. But this was different. This was his home. And that made it personal. A step outside. The wind had calmed, leaving the forest still and unsettlingly silent. David pulled on his coat and boots, his breath visible in the frigid air as he stepped onto the porch. Luna's head shot up immediately, her eyes locked onto him. "It's all right, girl," David murmured. "Just checking things out." Luna didn't relax. She remained stiff, ears perked, gaze flicking between him and the tree line. David scanned the snow, looking for anything out of place. The footprints he had seen last night were still there, partially covered by the snowfall, but still visible. He followed them carefully, moving toward the edge of the woods where the trees stood like silent sentinels. The tracks were deep. Whoever had been here had been standing still for a long time, watching. David felt his grip tighten around his rifle. That wasn't just passing curiosity. That was intent. He followed the tracks further, stepping into the shadow of the trees. The scent of pine and frozen earth filled his lungs as he moved cautiously between the trunks, his boots crunching over the snow. And then he saw it. A piece of rope tied tightly around the trunk of a tree, frayed at the edges but recently used. David narrowed his eyes, his mind clicking through the possibilities. A restraint, a leash. Someone had tied something, or someone here. His stomach twisted. Was it Luna? Had she been trapped here before escaping? His jaw clenched. If that was the case, then whoever had done this wasn't just looking for a lost pet. They were looking for something they thought belonged to them, and they weren't going to stop. Luna's reaction. When David returned to the cabin, his boots thudding against the wooden steps, Luna immediately rose to her feet. Her muscles tensed as he entered, her amber eyes flicking toward him, then past him, toward the outside. She knew. David knelt down, setting his rifle against the wall. He reached out slowly, letting his fingers hover just above her fur. She flinched at first, but then, cautiously, she allowed him to touch her. His hand moved over her back, gentle but firm. She was trembling. "You've been here before, haven't you?" he murmured. She didn't answer, of course, but the way she lowered her head, the way her ears folded back slightly, she didn't need to. David exhaled. "All right," he said softly. "We'll keep watch tonight. You're not alone anymore." Luna blinked up at him, and for the first time she didn't look afraid. A night of waiting. As the hours stretched on, the cabin was wrapped in silence. David sat in his chair, rifle within arm's reach, eyes trained on the window. The fire had burned lower now, casting faint, flickering shadows on the wooden walls. Luna lay near the door, her pups nestled against her side. She was still awake. She hadn't slept. Neither had David. Outside, the forest remained still, but the tension in the air hadn't lifted. If anything, it had grown heavier. Then a sound, soft, almost imperceptible. But it was there. David's grip tightened on his rifle as he slowly stood, careful not to make a sound. Luna was already up, her body stiff, her eyes locked on the window. A low growl rumbled in her throat. David moved toward the curtain, just enough to peek through a small gap. And then he saw it, a figure, standing at the tree line, watching, not moving, not speaking, just waiting. David's pulse quickened. The figure was shrouded in darkness, their form obscured by the faint glow of the moon reflecting off the snow. But there was no mistaking it. They were looking directly at the cabin, directly at Luna. David stepped back, his jaw tightening. Luna's growl deepened. "Yeah," David muttered. "I see him too." A warning given. David wasn't the type to wait for trouble to come knocking. He moved to the door and unlatched it. The cold rushed in as he stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand. Luna followed, standing just behind him. The figure remained where they were. David took a slow breath, then called out, "This is private property. If you've got business here, state it now." Silence. No movement. No response. David narrowed his eyes. "I won't ask twice." Then, the figure turned. No rush, no panic, just a slow, deliberate movement as they disappeared into the trees. David didn't lower his rifle. He watched until he was sure they were gone, then stepped back inside, locking the door behind him. Luna stood near the entrance, still tense. She knew this wasn't over. David ran a hand down his face, exhaling. Whatever was coming for them, it hadn't given up yet, and if that figure was who he thought it was, they were going to have a fight on their hands. Scene 5. The Seeker. The drive into town was quiet, except for the soft whimpering of the puppies nestled in the passenger seat. Luna sat stiffly beside them, her body coiled with tension as the truck rumbled down the snow-covered road. Her amber eyes flicked to the trees outside, scanning the landscape like she expected something, or someone, to emerge from the shadows at any moment. David Walker noticed. He had seen that kind of hyper-awareness before, in soldiers who had spent too much time in dangerous places, who had learned the hard way that safety was always temporary. Luna had been through hell, and David had a feeling it wasn't over yet. The vet clinic. The town's small veterinary clinic sat at the edge of the main street, a modest brick building with a wooden sign hanging above the door. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few vehicles belonging to the staff. David pulled into a spot near the entrance, then turned to Luna. "All right, girl, let's see if we can figure out what's going on with you." She didn't move. Her eyes darted to the door, then back to him. She wasn't just cautious, she was afraid. David sighed and reached over, gently stroking her fur. She flinched slightly, but didn't pull away. Another small step. He grabbed a thick blanket, wrapped it around the puppies, and carefully scooped them up. Luna followed as he stepped inside, her movements hesitant but deliberate. The clinic was warm, the scent of antiseptic and fur filling the air. A few locals sat in the waiting area, murmuring quietly while their pets lounged at their feet. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with short, graying hair and kind eyes, greeted him with a polite smile. "Morning," she said. "What can we do for you?" David nodded toward Luna. "She showed up at my cabin with these two," he said, adjusting the bundled-up puppies in his arms. "She's in rough shape. I need to make sure they're okay." The receptionist's gaze softened as she took in Luna's condition, the thin frame, the visible ribs, the scars that told a story of hardship. "I'll get Dr. Monroe," she said, disappearing into the back room. David took a seat, setting the pups on his lap. Luna stayed close, her body pressed against his leg. She was still watching the door, still waiting for something bad to happen. And that's when he noticed the man watching them. The stranger. He was sitting in the corner of the waiting room, partially obscured by the shadow of a potted plant. Tall, broad-shouldered, a heavy coat pulled tight around him, the hood still up despite being indoors. But it was his eyes that set David on edge, sharp, calculating, and locked onto Luna. David didn't react right away. Instead, he leaned back slightly, keeping his posture relaxed. But every part of him was on high alert. The man must have realized he had been caught staring because he stood abruptly and approached. David tensed, his muscles coiling instinctively. The man stopped a few feet away, his mouth curling into a smirk. "You found my dog," he said casually. David didn't blink. "That so?" The man nodded toward Luna. "Yeah, that's mine. Ran off a few weeks back." Luna stiffened instantly. David felt it, the way her entire body locked up, the way she pressed herself against his leg as if trying to disappear. Fear. Real, pure fear. And that told him everything he needed to know. David's voice was calm, but cold when he responded. "If she was yours, why'd she show up half-frozen with 2 starving pups?" The man's smirk faltered just slightly. "She got out," he said, shrugging. "Happens sometimes, but I appreciate you looking after her. You can hand her over now." David didn't move, and neither did Luna. She was shaking. Not visibly, but he could feel it in the way she clung to his leg, the way her breathing had quickened just slightly. She wasn't just afraid of this man. She knew him, and she didn't want to go back. "No," David said flatly. The man's expression darkened. "What?" "You heard me," David said, shifting slightly so that his body was between the man and Luna. "She's not going anywhere." For a moment, neither of them moved. The tension in the air was thick, like the seconds before a fight breaks out. Then Dr. Monroe appeared in the doorway. "Walker," she called, waving him over. "Bring them in." David stood, keeping his eyes on the man as he moved toward the exam room. The man didn't follow, but he didn't leave either. And that made David's skin crawl. The examination. Inside the exam room, Dr. Monroe carefully examined Luna and the pups. "She's underweight, but she'll recover," she said, running her fingers along Luna's ribs. "These scars, though, these aren't from accidents." David exhaled. "I figured." Monroe frowned. "You think that guy out there was her owner?" David's jaw tightened. "No, I think he was her captor." Monroe's expression darkened. "Well, she's safe now." David wasn't so sure. A warning given. When David stepped back into the waiting room, the man was still there, still watching. David walked straight toward him, stopping just inches away. "You don't want to push this," he said, his voice low, dangerous. The man smirked again, but this time there was no humor in it. "You don't know what you're dealing with, old man." David's eyes stayed locked onto his, unblinking, unshaken. "Neither do you." A moment of silence. Then the man chuckled, stepping back. "Keep her then," he said, turning toward the door. "But you just made a mistake." David didn't answer. He just watched as the man disappeared into the snow-covered street. But he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Scene 6, the first confrontation. The drive back to the cabin was uneventful, but David could feel the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him, like the thick storm clouds still lingering on the horizon. Luna lay curled on the seat beside him, her pups nestled close to her belly. She was quiet, but her ears twitched at every bump in the road, her muscles still tense beneath her thick fur. David knew that tension well. The kind that came from knowing danger wasn't far behind. He kept checking the rearview mirror, scanning the road behind him. He didn't see the man's car, if he even had one, but that didn't mean he wasn't following. That smirk, that threat. "You just made a mistake." David had been threatened before, many times, by men far more dangerous than some low-life dog abuser. But something about this guy, something felt off. He gripped the steering wheel tighter. If the bastard thought he was just going to hand Luna over, he was in for a rude awakening. The cabin, uneasy silence. By the time David pulled up to the cabin, the sun was dipping low behind the trees, casting long, dark shadows over the snow-covered ground. The forest was eerily still, the only sound the soft crunch of his boots as he stepped out of the truck. Luna hesitated before following, her paws sinking into the snow. She sniffed the air, her ears flicking as if listening for something unseen. The pups, oblivious to their mother's anxiety, remained tucked inside the blanket on the passenger seat. David scooped them up and walked toward the cabin. "Come on, girl," he murmured. Luna lingered by the truck for a moment longer before finally padding after him, but she never stopped scanning the tree line. David felt it too. That sense that something was off, like they weren't alone. He glanced toward the woods, his gut twisting. Nothing, but he still locked the door behind them, just in case. Preparing for trouble inside, the fire had died down, leaving the cabin dimly lit with only faint embers glowing in the hearth. David set the puppies down on the blanket near the fireplace and stoked the fire back to life, watching as the flames chased away the cold. Luna lay beside them, but never fully relaxed. Even as the warmth settled over them, even as the pups let out soft, sleepy whimpers, her eyes kept darting toward the door. David exhaled. She was expecting him to come back, and maybe she was right. He moved toward the gun rack mounted on the wall and grabbed his Winchester rifle, checking the rounds before setting it within reach near the chair by the window. He had spent years telling himself he didn't need it anymore, that his days of waiting for an enemy to appear were long behind him. But tonight, that feeling was back, that old instinct, and he wasn't about to ignore it. A shadow in the snow. The hours passed in silence. David sat near the window, the rifle resting against his leg, his eyes trained on the darkened forest outside. Luna remained near the door, curled protectively around her pups, but she wasn't sleeping. She was waiting. Then a noise, a soft crunch in the snow. David's grip on the rifle tightened. He didn't move, didn't breathe, just listened. Another crunch, closer this time. Then a shadow moved near the tree line. Someone was out there. David exhaled slowly, his mind sharpening. It could be an animal, a stray hunter. But deep down, he already knew. It was him, the bastard from the clinic. David rose silently, moving toward the door. Luna was already on her feet, a low growl rumbling in her throat. He cracked the door open just an inch, peering out into the darkness. The wind had picked up again, swirling snow around the trees. But through the movement, he saw it, a figure standing just beyond the porch, barely visible in the dim light, watching, waiting. David stepped outside, rifle in hand. "Didn't your mama ever tell you not to trespass?" he called, his voice calm but dangerous. The figure didn't move at first. Then slowly he stepped forward, just enough that David could see his face, the same smug grin from the clinic. "Nice place you got here," the man said. David kept his rifle steady, not raising it yet, but close enough to send a message. "You lost?" The man chuckled. "No, I think I found exactly what I was looking for." David's jaw tightened. The man's eyes flicked to the door behind him, to where Luna stood watching. Her growl had deepened now, a sound so low and full of warning that even the stranger's smirk faltered slightly. "She's mine," the man said. "You know that." David took a slow step forward. "No, she's not." The man's eyes narrowed. "You really want to make this difficult, old man?" David's finger rested lightly on the trigger. "I don't mind difficult." Silence. The wind howled through the trees, whipping snow between them. Then, after a long moment, the man exhaled sharply and took a step back. "All right," he said. "All right, I'll go." David didn't lower his rifle. "But," the man continued, that smug grin returning, "you can't watch her forever." David's hands tightened. The man's eyes flicked to Luna one last time, and then he turned, disappearing into the trees. David watched until he was sure the bastard was gone. Then, only then, did he lower the gun. He turned back to the cabin, stepping inside and bolting the door behind him. Luna's eyes were still on the door, her body still rigid. David crouched beside her, running a hand gently over her back. "He's not taking you," he murmured. Luna let out a shaky breath, and for the first time since she arrived, she leaned into him. David exhaled. This wasn't over, but tonight they had won. Scene 7. The chase in the blizzard. The wind had picked up again by the time David Walker stepped outside. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the sky was a blanket of darkness, broken only by the faint glow of the moon reflecting off the thick layer of snow. Luna stood beside him, ears pinned back, body stiff with unease. She knew. The bastard wasn't gone. David had spent years in the military tracking men who didn't want to be found. He had learned to recognize patterns, to read the silence between sounds. And right now, the woods surrounding his cabin were too quiet. His breath curled in the frigid air as he scanned the tree line, rifle steady in his hands. Then, a flash of movement, a shadow cutting between the trees. David's eyes locked onto it instantly, his grip tightening around the rifle stock. "Luna, inside," he muttered. She didn't move. Now. She hesitated, just for a second, but then she backed toward the porch, her pups hidden in the warmth of the cabin. David took a step forward, his boots crunching through the fresh snow. Another shadow moved, closer this time. Then, a sound, a sharp metallic click. David ducked on instinct. A split second later, a gunshot cracked through the night. The bullet slammed into the wooden beam of his porch, splintering the wood where his head had been moments ago. Shit. David moved, not toward the cabin, but toward the trees. If someone was shooting at him, the last thing he wanted was to be standing in the open like a damn target. The snow was thick, but he knew these woods better than whoever the hell was out there. He darted behind a tree, pressing his back against the cold bark, steadying his breath. The silence stretched. Then footsteps, slow, careful. They were looking for him. David adjusted his grip on his rifle, inhaled deeply, and stepped out, the fight for survival. The man was closer than David expected, less than 20 feet away, his pistol raised, scanning the area. Kyle Robertson. David didn't need a second to recognize him, the same bastard from the clinic, now standing in the middle of David's damn woods, armed and hunting. Kyle's breath came out in white puffs as he muttered something under his breath. David moved first. Before Kyle even registered the motion, David brought the butt of his rifle up and slammed it into the side of his head. Kyle grunted in pain, stumbling sideways into the snow, his gun flying from his grip. David didn't wait. He kicked the weapon further into the darkness. Kyle recovered quickly, lunging at David with a snarl. For a man who relied on intimidation, he was stronger than he looked. They crashed into the snow, rolling over the frozen ground in a tangle of fists and fury. Kyle landed a hard punch to David's ribs, knocking the breath from his lungs, but David wasn't some rookie in his first fight. He twisted, using Kyle's own momentum to flip him onto his back before driving his forearm into the man's throat. Kyle choked, his hands scrambling against David's arm. "This how you treat all your visitors?" Kyle rasped, his voice strained. David didn't reply. He just pressed harder. Kyle's face turned red, his eyes wild. Then, a sudden movement, his hand slipping toward his boot. David saw it too late. Kyle's fingers wrapped around a hidden blade, and he swung. Pain sliced through David's side. He gritted his teeth, but the shock forced him to loosen his grip just enough for Kyle to shove him off. David rolled, gripping his side as blood seeped into the fabric of his jacket. Kyle stumbled to his feet, panting. His knife glinted in the moonlight. "You should have stayed out of it," he sneered. "That dog, she's mine." David let out a breath, slow and controlled. Then he smiled. He said, "Tell her that." Kyle barely had time to turn before Luna slammed into him. She had launched from the tree line like a damn missile, knocking Kyle to the ground before he could react. She wasn't the scared, cowering animal from before. She was a fighter. She sank her teeth into his forearm, making him scream. Kyle tried to shake her off, but Luna wasn't letting go. David staggered to his feet, gripping his side as he reached for his rifle. Kyle was still flailing, trying to break free. Then, finally, he swung the knife at Luna's face. She yelped, recoiling. It was all Kyle needed. He scrambled back, blood dripping from his arm. His eyes locked onto David. "This ain't over," he spat. Then he turned and ran. David raised the rifle, but by the time he steadied his grip, Kyle had vanished into the trees. David let him go, for now. The aftermath, Luna whimpered slightly, shaking her head. The blade had only grazed her, but David could see a thin cut along the side of her muzzle. He knelt beside her, pressing a hand to her fur. "You okay, girl?" She licked his palm. David exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He had expected Kyle to come back, but he hadn't expected him to come with a damn gun. He wasn't just some punk looking for his lost dog. He was dangerous. And if David had learned anything about men like him, it was this. They never gave up that easily. David looked back toward the cabin, where Luna's pups were still safely inside. He had a decision to make. Running wasn't an option. Kyle wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted, and David wasn't going to let him take her. His fingers curled into a fist. If Kyle wanted a fight, he'd damn well get one. Scene 8, The Desperate Call. The inside of the cabin was eerily quiet. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls, but the warmth it provided did little to ease the cold tension lingering in the air. David Walker winced as he peeled back his blood-soaked jacket, revealing the deep gash Kyle had left on his side. He muttered a curse under his breath. It wasn't deep enough to be life-threatening, but it was still a damn inconvenience. Luna lay beside him, her amber eyes fixed on his every movement. She had taken a hit too, a thin cut along the side of her muzzle where Kyle had swung the knife at her, but she barely seemed to notice. Her focus was elsewhere. She was listening, waiting. David pressed a clean cloth to his wound, inhaling sharply at the sting. "You're a tough girl, huh?" he muttered, glancing at Luna. Didn't even flinch. She blinked at him but said nothing, her ears twitching slightly. David exhaled. Kyle had run off, but David knew better than to believe the fight was over. Men like Kyle, they didn't just let things go, and now he had Kyle's blood on his land. That meant one of two things. Either Kyle would come back alone, angrier than before, or he'd bring friends. David wasn't about to wait and find out. Making the call. David grabbed his satellite phone from the shelf. He rarely used it, barely even turned it on unless absolutely necessary, but tonight was one of those times. He dialed a number he hadn't called in years. The phone rang twice before a familiar, no-nonsense voice answered. "Sheriff Morgan." David sighed, leaning back against the chair. "It's Walker." A pause. Then, a dry chuckle. Well, I was starting to think you went feral up in that cabin of yours." David smirked despite himself. "Not yet, but I've got a situation." Morgan's tone immediately shifted. "What kind of situation?" David glanced at Luna, who was still lying beside him, eyes locked on the door. I got a dog that showed up at my place a few nights ago, starving, half frozen, with 2 pups in tow. Morgan exhaled. And a guy just showed up claiming she's his. Another pause. You think he's lying? David's jaw tightened. I know he is. The sheriff was quiet for a moment. Walker, I know you're used to handling things on your own, but if you're calling me, I'm guessing this is more than just a property dispute. David's grip on the phone tightened. He had a gun. Morgan swore under his breath. You all right? Took a cut. Nothing major. Tell me everything. David ran through the events of the past few days. Luna's arrival, Kyle showing up at the clinic, the threats, and then finally, the confrontation in the woods. When he finished, Morgan let out a long breath. This guy, the sheriff said. You get a name? Kyle Robertson. Morgan cursed again. Yeah, that name rings a bell. David's eyes narrowed. How so? He's been on our radar for a while, involved in some shady business, illegal dog breeding, underground fights, you name it, but we never had enough to pin anything solid on him. David's stomach twisted. So Luna, she was probably one of his, Morgan confirmed. And if she ran, there's a reason. David looked at Luna. She was still tense, still waiting. She had escaped hell, and now hell wanted her back. Morgan's voice was serious when he spoke again. Listen to me, Walker. If this guy came all the way out there, it means he wants that dog back bad. You need to be careful. David scoffed. Careful was about 3 steps ago. Morgan sighed. Yeah, figured as much. All right, sit tight. I'll head up there in the morning, see if we can sort this out. David's fingers tapped the wooden armrest of his chair. That might be too late. Morgan was quiet for a beat. Then, you think he's coming back? David's jaw clenched. I don't think. I know. The watch begins. After hanging up, David sat in silence for a long moment, running his fingers through his graying hair. He knew Morgan would help if it came down to it, but that didn't mean he could sit back and wait. Kyle had already crossed a line, and David wasn't about to let the bastard cross another. He stood slowly, wincing at the pull of his wound, and moved toward the cabinet where he kept his ammunition. Luna followed him, watching his every move. I get it, David murmured, loading a fresh magazine into his rifle. You don't trust anyone. Not after what you've been through. Luna didn't react, but something in her eyes softened just slightly. David leaned down, pressing a hand against her thick fur. Well, you're not alone anymore, girl. For the first time, Luna let out a slow breath and leaned into his touch, a silent acknowledgement, a silent trust. Then, a noise outside, a faint crunch in the snow. David froze. Luna's ears shot up. Another crunch. This time, closer. David moved to the window and peered outside. The moon was still bright enough to illuminate the snow, casting long shadows across the ground. And then he saw them. Footprints, fresh, leading toward the cabin. His pulse steadied. This was it. Kyle hadn't waited until morning. He was back. And this time, he wasn't coming alone. The final preparation. David didn't waste time. He moved quickly, securing every entrance, windows, doors, even checking the back of the cabin. He placed extra rounds within reach, made sure his rifle was loaded. Luna followed his every movement, her body coiled like a spring ready to snap. David knelt beside her. We finish this tonight, he murmured. Luna didn't move, didn't blink, but David could see it in her eyes. She was ready. Because for the first time, she wasn't just running, she was fighting back. David stood, exhaling slowly. Then, rifle in hand, he turned toward the door and waited. Scene 9, the final rescue. The cabin was silent except for the soft crackling of the dying fire. David Walker stood near the window, his breath steady, his rifle held loosely but ready. Luna was beside him, her body tense, ears pricked forward, her amber eyes locked on the door. Outside, the night was thick with shadows. The moon cast long, eerie streaks of light over the snow, illuminating the fresh footprints that led straight toward the cabin. Kyle Robertson wasn't alone this time. David could feel it in his bones, the break-in. The first sign of trouble came as a rustling sound just beyond the porch. Then a low voice. You sure he's in there? David's grip tightened. There was more than one. He could hear at least 2 men, maybe 3, their voices hushed but urgent. Yeah, another voice responded. Truck's still here. He's not going anywhere. Luna let out a deep, guttural growl. David exhaled through his nose. This was it. Then, a loud bang. The front door shuddered violently as something heavy slammed against it. David didn't move. Another bang. Harder this time. They were trying to break in. He raised his rifle, took a steadying breath, and aimed for the door. The first shot. The door crashed open. David didn't hesitate. Boom. The first shot ripped through the air, splintering the wooden frame just inches away from where Kyle had been standing. "Shit, he's armed," one of the men shouted, scrambling backward. David cocked the rifle. "Damn right, I'm armed." His voice was calm, cold, deadly. Kyle stared him down, breathing hard. His face was twisted in frustration, but there was something else in his eyes now. Doubt. "Walk away," David said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Last chance." Kyle's hand hovered near his gun holster. His jaw clenched. David tightened his finger on the trigger. Then, the sound of tires crunching against snow. Headlights flashed through the trees, and then the wail of a siren. Kyle cursed loudly. The sheriff arrives. A black SUV pulled up in a spray of slush, and within seconds, Sheriff Morgan was out, his gun drawn. "Drop it," Morgan barked. "Hands in the air." Kyle froze. One of his men bolted toward the trees, but he barely made it 5 feet before another officer tackled him to the ground. Morgan's eyes flicked to David. "You all right?" David lowered his rifle slightly, but kept his stance firm. "Been worse." Morgan turned his attention back to Kyle. "You're done, Robertson." Kyle's jaw worked as if he was chewing on something bitter. Then, he smirked. "You think this ends here?" Morgan wasn't in the mood. He grabbed Kyle's arm and slammed him against the hood of the SUV. "You're under arrest for trespassing, attempted assault, and possession of an unregistered firearm." David exhaled, finally lowering his weapon completely. Luna stood beside him, still growling softly. Morgan glanced at the dog, then back at Kyle. "You want to explain why you were breaking into Walker's cabin over a damn dog?" Kyle spat into the snow. "That's my dog." Luna flinched. Morgan didn't miss it. "She doesn't seem to think so," the sheriff said dryly. Kyle's smirk faltered. David stepped forward, his voice low and deliberate. "You abused her, chained her, used her for who knows what." He shook his head, eyes hard. "You don't deserve to breathe the same air as her." Kyle let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "You think you're some kind of hero?" He looked between David and Morgan. "You think putting me away is going to fix everything?" Morgan yanked his arm behind his back. "I don't give a damn about fixing you. I just want you off my streets." Kyle grimaced as the cuffs snapped shut around his wrists. "Enjoy your cell," Morgan muttered. Kyle glared at David one last time. Then finally, he was shoved into the back of the SUV, the aftermath. The other men were rounded up, weapons confiscated, statements taken. By the time the scene cleared, the first hints of dawn were breaking through the trees. Morgan leaned against his vehicle, rubbing his temple. "Well," he muttered, "hell of a night." David crossed his arms. No argument there. Morgan sighed. "You sure you're okay?" David hesitated. Then, finally, he looked at Luna. She was watching him, but she wasn't afraid anymore. He reached down, resting a hand against her thick fur. "She's safe," David murmured. "That's all that matters." Morgan studied him for a long moment before nodding. "You ever need anything, Walker, you call me." David smirked faintly. "I'll think about it." Morgan shook his head, chuckling. "Yeah, that's what I thought." He clapped David on the shoulder before climbing into his SUV. "Take care of yourself." David watched as the vehicles disappeared down the winding road. Then, for the first time in days, the cabin felt truly quiet. A new beginning inside. The fire was still burning low. Luna curled up near the hearth, her pups nestled against her. David stood in the doorway, watching them. "You did good, girl," he murmured. Luna lifted her head, blinking up at him, and then she wagged her tail. Just once. But it was enough. David let out a slow breath. He had spent years pushing people away, years convincing himself he didn't need anyone. But looking at Luna and her pups, at the family they had unexpectedly become, he realized something. He wasn't alone anymore, and maybe, just maybe, he never had to be again. Scene 10, a new family. The first morning after the storm felt different. The sky was clear, a soft pale blue stretching over the frozen landscape. The snow, once thick and relentless, now lay still, untouched except for the fading tracks of Sheriff Morgan's SUV. David Walker stood outside his cabin, breathing in the crisp winter air. The cold stung his lungs, but it felt good, like a fresh start. The events of the past few nights lingered in his mind, but for the first time in years, his home didn't feel empty. Behind him, Luna padded out onto the porch, sniffing the air cautiously before stepping beside him. Her ears twitched, her breath coming out in soft white puffs. David glanced down at her. She wasn't the same dog that had arrived on his doorstep. Gone was the fearful, half-starved animal that had flinched at every movement. She was stronger now. Her coat was healthier, her body no longer trembling from exhaustion or cold. She still had her scars, those would never fully fade. But neither did he. David sighed, rubbing a hand over his still sore ribs. Guess we're both a little beat up, huh? Luna didn't answer, of course, but this time she leaned into him. A silent response, a silent trust. David let his hand rest on her back, feeling the warmth of her fur beneath his fingers. She had chosen to stay, and he wasn't going to let her regret it. Settling in, back inside, the warmth from the fire wrapped around the cabin like a protective embrace. The two puppies, Shadow and Frost, were curled up near the hearth, their tiny bodies rising and falling with soft, steady breaths. David watched them for a moment before shaking his head. Didn't plan on getting roommates, he muttered, let alone 3 of them. Luna huffed quietly, settling down beside her pups. David sat in his chair, leaning back with a sigh. His ribs ached from the fight, and his muscles were sore, but he wasn't complaining, because for the first time in a long time, he had something to fight for. His gaze drifted toward the window. Morgan had promised to keep an eye on things, to make sure Kyle and his people didn't try anything stupid. David believed him, but he also knew men like Kyle didn't give up easily. Kyle might be in jail, but that didn't mean this was over. David's fingers tapped absently against the armrest of his chair. He wasn't going to let his guard down. Not now. Not ever. Luna watched him from across the room, her amber eyes unblinking, like she knew exactly what he was thinking. David smirked. Guess we've both got some bad habits. She let out a soft woof, curling her body protectively around her pups. David sighed, shaking his head. You ever gonna let yourself relax, girl? Luna blinked at him. Then, to his utter shock, she stretched out and laid her head on his boot. David froze. She had been cautious since day one, always keeping a bit of distance. But now, she was close, not just physically, but trusting him in a way she hadn't before. He swallowed. All right, he muttered. Guess I'm not so bad. Luna let out a slow, content breath. David didn't move, didn't dare, because he knew exactly how much that moment meant to both of them. The first walk later that afternoon, after making sure his ribs weren't screaming at him anymore, David grabbed his coat and boots. Luna perked up immediately. Come on, girl, he said, grabbing the leash the vet had given him. Let's see if you remember what it's like to walk without running. Luna hesitated. David could see it in her eyes. The conflict, the instinct to run. Then slowly, carefully, she stepped forward. David clipped the leash to her collar, giving her a moment. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away, just waited. Another step forward, another sign of trust. David exhaled, leading her toward the porch. The snow was thick beneath their boots and paws, but the air was calm. No wind, no threat of a storm, just peace. Luna sniffed the ground, then lifted her nose to the sky as if tasting the new air. David watched her, waiting. Then for the first time she wagged her tail. A small, hesitant movement, but it was there. David's chest tightened in a way he didn't expect. You like it here, huh? He asked, adjusting his grip on the leash. Luna didn't answer, but she didn't have to. She had already chosen this place, and in some way this place had chosen her too. A home, at last. The weeks passed, and the cabin no longer felt like it belonged to just one man. Luna became comfortable, not just in the cabin, but with him. She still had her moments, flinching at sudden noises, watching the door a little too long when the wind blew too hard. But every day, she trusted him a little more. And David? For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. Shadow and Frost grew stronger, their tiny barks filling the once quiet space. They tumbled across the wooden floors, wrestling and yipping, completely unaware of the darkness their mother had escaped from. David didn't mind the noise. Not anymore. One night, as he sat in his chair by the fire, Luna curled up beside him, her head resting on his foot like it belonged there. David glanced down at her, exhaling slowly. You're home now, girl. Luna blinked up at him. Then she closed her eyes. David let the silence settle around them, but this time, it wasn't empty. For the first time in a long, long time, the quiet wasn't loneliness. It was peace. It was family. It was home.